On 25 September 1997, in Amman, the sidewalk opposite Markaz al-Shamia on Garden Street holds its breath under ordinary daylight. Cars pass. Office doors open and close. Two men who appear to be tourists linger near the entrance, close enough to smell the warm metal of a shaken soda can. One hand stays low, domestic in its familiarity, thumb under the tab, a gesture that belongs to lunch breaks and convenience stores, not state violence. A survivor would later describe it not as pain at first, but as sound, a loud noise, like a boom, like an electric shock. He keeps walking, because people keep walking when they do not yet know they have been marked. In later accounts, the plan was meant to look like an accident, nothing more than fizz and clumsiness on a public street. But the day stays quiet only on the surface. And quiet, in operations like this, is never free. By 26 October 1994, at the Arava crossing point along the Jordan-Israel border, the public ritual is peace, signatures, flags, officials standing in daylight before cameras from around the world. King Hussein of Jordan and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel formalize relations after decades of tension, and the region learns a new kind of border language: stamps, coordination, embassies, predictable channels. The paper trail is designed to reduce surprise, to make crossings routine, to transform enemies into neighbors who share procedures. For clandestine services, predictability is not a moral victory, it is terrain. A functioning treaty creates habits, airport procedures that feel routine, diplomatic spaces that look like administrative necessity, foreign passports that can pass through a queue if the cover is clean enough. In later years, that normalcy will be exploited, not celebrated. The irony is structural. A treaty intended to prevent one state from using the other as a staging ground becomes, within 3 years, the context for an operation that does exactly that. The cover does not need to be brilliant. It only needs to match the background noise of a city that has learned to trust the mechanics of peace. Embassy staff move through customs without incident. Businessmen cross borders with handshakes instead of interrogations. The friction that once defined these crossings softens into bureaucratic rhythm. Peace, in this reading, can become camouflage when institutions learn to trust their own procedures. 3 years later, that trust will be tested on a single sidewalk in Amman, when men carrying foreign passports walk through the same airport that peace built. On 21 September 1997, in Amman, one Hamas figure, Ibrahim Gusha, returns home after a period of detention and finds his house filling with visitors. The scene is domestic and political at the same time. Men arriving with condolences and congratulations. Tea poured, because that is what you do when people keep coming. Conversation turning into testimony by accumulation. The living room becomes a kind of informal headquarters, voices layering over one another, news shared in fragments. In this atmosphere, Khalid Meshal is not yet a headline, he is a name moving through rooms. A man who will soon walk a familiar route to an office on Garden Street like thousands of others do every morning. The week carries a fragile sense of routine, the kind that convinces communities they can survive pressure by continuing to behave normally. Hamas leadership in Amman operates in a peculiar zone tolerated by Jordanian authorities, watched but not silenced, allowed to maintain offices and hold meetings as long as certain lines remain uncrossed. This is where deception begins to work on everyone. The state, the movement, the operatives observing from a distance. Each side performs normality as a shield. A calm street becomes a shared fiction that all parties maintain for different reasons. And fictions are easiest to enter when a city is busy living. When the rhythm of visits and tea and political conversation creates a kind of ambient cover that makes surveillance feel almost routine. The visitors at Gusha's door do not know they are being counted, their arrivals logged by watchers they cannot see. Repetition is a kind of anesthesia. It dulls suspicion until the moment it does not. While visitors knock at one door, others arrive through another. An airport corridor with no applause, no ceremony, no record of applause. On 25 September 1997, the operation becomes visible only as the absence of visibility. Agents enter Jordan on false Canadian passports, described in multiple accounts as disguised as tourists. The cover is deliberately small, no uniforms, no weapons displayed, no drama. The point is to blend into the day's most boring category. Foreigners taking up space in a city that hosts thousands of them. A later reconstruction, drawing on Jordanian and international reporting, describes a 6-member team arriving in Amman roughly a week before the attempt. The record does not preserve the private texture of their safe house, what they ate, how they slept, what they said to one another in the waiting hours, but it preserves the public logic. They needed proximity to Meshal's routine. And routine is learned by watching it repeat. Tradecraft here is not gadgets or dramatic technology. It is patience, the slow conversion of a target's ordinary habits into a predictable schedule. Surveillance is the quiet labor of turning a human being into a time and place problem. A body that will be at a specific location, at a specific hour. The agent's cover self-tourist, passerby, anonymous, is meant to be disposable. But disposable identities still require a body to inhabit them. That body must walk the street without flinching, must hold a camera like someone who wants photographs, must sit in cafes without looking at the door too often. A legend is not just paperwork. It is the ability to live inside a lie without showing strain. Canada, in this operation, becomes an unwitting accomplice, its passport a piece of borrowed credibility that will later generate its own diplomatic crisis. On Garden Street, the lie will have to move close enough to touch skin. In intelligence work, the cover is never just concealment. It is the first compromise, the first thing that must be maintained even as everything else falls apart. On 25 September 1997 in Amman, Khaled Meshal is walking toward a Hamas office, in a country that has signed a peace treaty with Israel, and that contradiction makes him more than a militant leader. He is, effectively, a test case. Can Jordan host Hamas figures without becoming the battlefield of someone else's policy? The tension is structural, built into the geography of his daily commute. Israel's motive, described in later reporting and subsequent investigations, is framed as retaliation amid a cycle of attacks and counterattacks that defined the 1990s. Suicide bombings in Israeli cities had killed civilians. Hamas had claimed responsibility for several. But motive is not the same as moral clarity. The archive shows competing narratives. To some, Meshal is a commander who authorizes violence. To others, a political figure in exile, pursuing a cause through available means. To Jordan, a citizen whose death on its soil would constitute a sovereignty crisis of the highest order. The target's world is a street-level routine. Arriving by car, walking the last meters to the office, entering a building that looks like any other commercial space. No convoy, no spectacle of protection. The banality is part of what makes the moment workable for those planning his death. Parallel to him, in at least one first-hand account, are 2 unarmed bodyguards, companions for the walk, rather than a security detail equipped for confrontation. One of them is Muhammad Abu Saif, whose name will become central to what follows. Their presence is also routine close protection that looks like ordinary companionship until it becomes a sprint down a public street. Assassination planning feeds on the ordinary. The simplest patterns are the easiest to weaponize. The agents watching have learned his schedule not through brilliance but through repetition, through days of noting when he arrives and which door he uses. 2 men step close behind him, close enough that the attempt can pretend to be nothing at all. Still on 25 September 1997, opposite Markaz al-Shamia on Garden Street, the choreography reaches its tightest point. According to at least one detailed account, Meshal and his bodyguards encounter 2 men who appear to be tourists, unremarkable figures in a city that sees thousands of foreign visitors. The closing of distance is minimal, the kind of moment pedestrians share without memory, bodies passing on a sidewalk in the ordinary friction of urban movement. Then the operative's hand brings an instrument to Meshal's ear. The record is careful in its language across multiple sources. An instrument under his ear, a device, sprayed poison, a fast-acting toxin. Even in reporting, specifics thin out, as if detail itself could be dangerous or legally consequential. What is consistent is the method. Something delivered to the skin near his ear. Something designed to enter the body without leaving an obvious wound. One survivor description later reduces the moment to pure sensation. A boom, an electric shock. It does not feel like what people imagine an assassination feels like. There is no gunshot, no visible weapon, no blood on the pavement. It feels like confusion, like something has gone wrong with the nervous system itself. Meshal keeps moving, because the human brain defaults to normality until it cannot. Because walking is what you do on a street, even when your body has begun to betray you. A later Israeli account adds an almost humiliating domestic interruption. A call from Meshal's daughter from the car causes him to turn his head at the wrong moment, throwing off the clean geometry of the hit. The operative's aim shifts. The delivery is imperfect. It is a reminder that families unbriefed, uninvolved, knowing nothing of what is about to happen, still shape outcomes in ways no operational plan can predict. The most powerful countermeasure is sometimes unintentional. A child's voice, a half-second turn of the head. The agents run because the street has noticed, because someone has decided to chase. On 25 September 1997, the operation collapses into improvisation. Mohammed Abu Saif, one of Meshal's bodyguards, does not hesitate. He runs after the suspects as they flee down Garden Street toward a waiting vehicle. A car is described in accounts as parked near Al Sarwat restaurant, and the suspects are driven away before Abu Saif can reach them on foot. But he does not stop. Abu Saif flags down a private car, explains the situation to the driver in urgent fragments, and the pursuit continues, ordinary vehicles pressed into extraordinary urgency. A chase conducted not by police but by a bodyguard and a stranger who chose to help. At some point, one account places the suspects headed toward Al-Medina Street. The car that assisted the operatives is said, in some narratives, to have delivered the device or what remained of it to the Israeli embassy in the Al-Rabia neighborhood. The embassy, normally the ultimate symbol of state-to-state formality, becomes in this narrative a place to hide men and objects that the peace treaty was supposed to make unnecessary. The capture itself is not sleek. It is physical and ugly, a bloody fight, exhaustion, injuries on both sides. The men do not surrender quietly. They resist until they cannot resist further. A passing officer of the Palestine Liberation Army, identified in accounts as Badr Naim al-Khatib, enters the scene and helps subdue the suspects. They are taken to Bayadir Wadi al-Sayr police station. This is where the legend fails completely. When police stations enter the story, control leaves the field and moves to governments. The false Canadian passports become evidence. The cover identities become subjects of interrogation. The bodies that inhabited tourist personas are now bodies in custody, linked to a state that will have to answer for them. The failure of tradecraft is rarely cinematic. It is usually a breathless scuffle and the beginning of a paper trail. While two agents sit in custody, the real clock starts elsewhere inside a hospital where Meshal's body is beginning to shut down. By late afternoon on 25 September 1997, Meshal's condition deteriorates rapidly. One account describes him being rushed to the Islamic hospital in Amman, where doctors attempt treatment without success, without even knowing what they are treating. The symptoms are neurological, systemic, and worsening by the hour. Security forces surround the facility as word spreads that something has happened to a Hamas leader. An order is given to transfer him to the King Hussein Medical Center, sometimes described as part of Hussein Medical City, where more advanced resources might be available. Fluorescent light replaces sunlight. The street noise of Garden Street becomes corridor silence and the rhythm of medical equipment. The problem is inseparable from its politics. Doctors need to know what was delivered to his ear, but the operation was designed to leave no obvious trace. The poison, later identified in some accounts as a synthetic opioid derivative, possibly related to fentanyl, was chosen precisely because it would be difficult to diagnose and treat without specific knowledge. The most important equipment in the story becomes not a weapon but information. What substance? What antidote? What reversal protocol? Without that knowledge, medicine becomes guessing, and guessing becomes a countdown toward death. A religious figure, Sheikh Ibrahim Zaid al-Kilani, appears in one account as someone trying to help open communication channels. Contacting Dr. Ashraf al-Kurdi, identified as Jordan's health minister at the time. The record shows the scrambling of institutions, state health officials, Hamas networks, Jordanian security services, all converging around a man breathing through tubes while machines track his declining vital signs. The covert plan had wanted a clean outcome without a scene. A man collapses on a street, perhaps from a heart attack or stroke, and by the time anyone understands what happened, the agents are gone and the body tells no useful story. Instead, the scene moves indoors and becomes impossible to hide, impossible to dismiss, impossible to resolve without confrontation. Poison turns governance into triage. The body first, the treaty second, the truth last. In the next room, Jordan decides this is no longer a medical emergency. It is a sovereignty emergency. On 26 September 1997, Amman's crisis becomes overt diplomacy conducted at the highest levels. Reports and later accounts converge on the central fact. King Hussein demands an antidote and signals that relations with Israel could be severed if Meshal dies. The threat is not merely legal or procedural. It is symbolic. A peace treaty publicly violated in the most humiliating way possible by an assassination attempt carried out on Jordanian soil by agents of the treaty partner, using forged documents from a third country. The standoff widens by the hour. Other members of the Mossad team beyond the two captured on the street are reported in some accounts to be secured in the Israeli embassy. Jordanian security forces surround or apply pressure to diplomatic spaces that are normally inviolable. Meanwhile, Meshal's body becomes a countdown that no negotiation can pause or accelerate. The toxin continues its work regardless of what diplomats say to one another. In several narratives, United States President Bill Clinton intervenes, applying pressure that reframes the event as an international embarrassment requiring immediate resolution, not merely a bilateral dispute between Jordan and Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, as Israeli Prime Minister, is repeatedly described as central, both in authorizing the original attempt and in deciding whether to release the antidote. The decision sits on his desk while a man dies slowly in a hospital bed hundreds of kilometers away. No one speaks in the language of morality during these hours. They speak in leverage. Agents in custody whose fate depends on cooperation. A leader in a coma whose survival depends on information only one party possesses. A treaty that can be damaged beyond repair with a single refusal. The calculations are cold and mathematical. If Meshal dies, Jordan loses a citizen and gains a legitimate grievance that could unravel everything built since 1994. If Israel refuses the antidote, it loses its agents and potentially its only formal peace with an Arab neighbor besides Egypt. The real weapon is no longer the device that touched Meshal's ear, it is the decision to withhold or surrender knowledge. The antidote becomes an object with its own gravity, rumored to be close, hidden in plain sight somewhere between Tel Aviv and Amman. On 27 September 1997, a Saturday, the narrative pivots on a small medical delivery that will have consequences far beyond the hospital room. One first-hand account describes rumors circulating of a doctor in an Amman hotel holding the antidote, waiting for authorization to deliver it. Another set of reports describes Israeli officials ultimately providing what Jordan demanded after intensive pressure from King Hussein and the Clinton administration. The record is consistent on outcome, even when it remains thin on mechanics. Meshal receives an antidote, and his condition improves. In the hospital, improvement is measured in machines removed and breathing regained. The scene remains clinical. Tubing disconnected, monitors showing stabilizing numbers, the soft friction of sheets as staff reposition a patient who could not move himself hours earlier. It is not triumph. It is stabilization. The body pulled back from a threshold it had nearly crossed. The medical staff who had been guessing now have something to work with, a protocol that reverses what the poison had begun. Outside the hospital, the antidote is inseparable from bargaining. The agents in custody are no longer simply two men who failed an operation. They are state property, intelligence assets whose value is measured in what they can be exchanged for. Meshal is no longer simply a Hamas official who survived an attempt on his life. He is now the reason a peace treaty might unravel, the living evidence of a violation that cannot be denied or explained away. The soda can, so ordinary it barely deserves description, has already done its work as motif. In a later account, the can was meant to provide misdirection, a prop to make the approach look like two tourists sharing a drink, the hiss of carbonation covering the hiss of something else entirely. Now it lingers in memory as a symbol of what this operation tried to be. Casual, deniable, clean. The kind of thing that could be dismissed as an accident or a medical episode. But nothing about the aftermath is clean. When a covert action needs an antidote delivered by negotiation, the operation has already admitted it was never fully controllable. By Sunday, Meshal breathes on his own, but government still cannot. By 29 September 1997, one account says Meshal is almost back to normal. The immediate physical danger recedes, the tubes are removed, and a different struggle takes over. Narrative control. Who were the attackers? Tourists? Canadians? Agents of a foreign intelligence service? The question is not academic. It determines whether Jordan can claim its sovereignty was violated, whether Israel can maintain any shred of deniability, whether Hamas can claim a propaganda victory that will resonate for years. A Jordanian official, Abdel Salam al-Majali, appears in later descriptions as someone involved in managing the treaty framework during this period. Jordanian security leadership is described in one source as initially spreading confusion about identity claims that the suspects were simply Canadian tourists, a claim that would later be undermined by the broader diplomatic crisis and the eventual admission of Israeli involvement. In the same first-hand account, Sami al-Batiki, then head of Jordanian intelligence, is portrayed as circulating early misinformation while managing multiple pressures simultaneously. The Jordanian information minister Samir Moutawi is described making public statements that minimize the event, even as private negotiations proceed at fever pitch. Meanwhile, Hamas figures describe pursuing a prisoner exchange, framing the captured agents as bargaining chips for imprisoned leaders, including Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the paralyzed founder and spiritual leader of Hamas who had been in Israeli custody for years. The record shows how quickly operation becomes policy once cameras and official communiques replace street contact. The agents captured on Garden Street are no longer individuals who failed a mission. They are pieces in a negotiation that will reshape the region's politics. The psychological wear is visible not in confessions but in improvisation. Governments patching stories that do not quite hold together. Agencies managing institutional shame. Officials trying to sound certain when they are clearly reacting to events beyond their control. The information war sounds like noise because it is noise competing narratives shouted over one another while the facts remain contested. After the body recovers, institutions begin to bruise reputation, credibility. The fragile fiction that any government fully controls what happens within its borders or what its agents do abroad. The next move will not happen on a sidewalk or in a ward, but on an airfield with a helicopter waiting. On 1 October 1997, Israel releases Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the paralyzed Hamas founder and spiritual leader, as part of the arrangement that follows the failed attempt on Meshal. Press reporting from the period describes Yassin being flown by Jordanian military helicopter to Amman, where he is hospitalized, his physical fragility turning the exchange into a spectacle of vulnerability broadcast across the region. Yassin, quadriplegic and nearly blind, had been imprisoned in Israel since 1989, sentenced to life for ordering the killing of Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel and for founding Hamas. His release had been demanded by Hamas for years, that it comes now, as the price of a botched assassination adds layers of irony that no official statement can smooth away. This is what blowback looks like in procedural detail. A covert act triggers a public concession. The state that tried to kill one Hamas leader must free another, and the world watches the transaction as proof that clandestine force can misfire into strategic loss. The mathematics are brutal. Israel recovers its agents, 6 in total, according to most accounts, but surrenders a prisoner whose symbolic value exceeds any operational calculation. Yassin's presence in Amman becomes its own archive. Hospital corridors again. Questions asked at a press conference where journalists crowd around a man in a wheelchair, supporters reading meaning into every gesture and word. In one account, Jordan receives him formally before arrangements are made for his return to Gaza. In another, he is flown onward almost immediately and greeted there as a returning symbol of resistance. The footage from that arrival, crowds, celebration, a frail man presented as a victory, will be replayed for years. The irony is sharp and quiet. The antidote saved Meshal's life, but it also saved the agents who tried to kill him, and the prices paid by a third man, moved across borders like a political object whose value is measured in what he represents rather than what he can do. Covert operations gamble that consequences will remain private, that failures can be buried in classified files. Here, consequence arrives on rotor noise, visible to anyone with a television. Days later, Meshal speaks in public alive, steadier than expected, and the story hardens into legend. On 3 October 1997, Meshal appears looking fit in a press setting at his home in Jordan, according to contemporary reporting from the period. He identifies the attempt as an assassination effort by Israeli agents and describes survival without offering the clean revenge narrative that audiences often expect from such moments. He returns instead to the sensory truth, the shock, the confusion, the sudden wrongness in his body, the fact that life can be altered by something so small it does not even look like violence. The moment of the attack, in his telling, was not dramatic. It was disorienting. A rupture in ordinary experience that only later acquired its full meaning. The diplomatic repercussions widen beyond Jordan and Israel in the days that follow. Because the agents used false Canadian passports, Canada is pulled into the affair not as an actor in the conflict, but as a nation whose documents became tools of deception. This is the bureaucratic aftermath of clandestine work. Identity fraud that forces third parties to absorb reputational damage they did nothing to earn. Canada protests. Investigations are launched. The relationship between Ottawa and Jerusalem acquires new friction. For Israel, the operation becomes a case study in success defined as survival rather than completion. The target lived. The agents were captured. The political cost exceeded any possible benefit. For Hamas, it becomes propaganda oxygen that will fuel recruitment and fundraising for years, proof that Israel fears them enough to attempt assassination, and proof that such attempts can fail. For Jordan, it becomes evidence that sovereignty can be violated even during peace, even by a treaty partner, even in broad daylight on a commercial street. The week reshapes how all three governments understand what the treaty means and what it protects. For the operatives themselves, the record is mostly silence. Their names do not appear in most accounts. Their fates after release remain largely unpublicized. But the sequence bungled approach, capture, interrogation, bargaining, exposure reads like a manual for how not to conduct clandestine action in a partner country. When a covert team borrows a country's identity, they leave that country holding the shame. Years later, the bargain's meaning will surface again, because the cycle does not end with one saved life or one released prisoner. On 22 March 2004, in Gaza City, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin is assassinated in an Israeli airstrike years after his 1997 release became the price of saving Meshal and recovering captured agents. The archive does not frame this as a neat resolution. It frames it as continuation. The man released because a covert hit failed is later killed by overt force, by missiles fired from a helicopter as he leaves a mosque at dawn. The wheelchair, the blindness, The physical frailty that had made his release such a potent image, none of it provides protection when policy changes and patience runs out. This is where the documentary record turns morally quiet. The viewer is tempted to narrate justice, deterrence, inevitability, to find in Yasin's death some closure for what began on Garden Street 7 years earlier. But the record offers something colder. Actions that trigger reactions, each side claiming necessity, each side producing grief and propaganda in equal measure. The cycle continues past Yasin's death, past the Second Intifada, past wars in Gaza that kill thousands, past negotiations that collapse and resume and collapse again. If there is a psychological arc in this story, it is not a confession or a revelation. It is the slow realization that secrecy does not erase responsibility. It only delays the moment when responsibility becomes public, becomes undeniable, becomes a debt that must be paid in one currency or another. Return, finally, to Garden Street in Amman, in the mind's eye. A building entrance, sunlight on pavement, a tab lifting on a can. The hiss is ordinary. That is the point. The sound belongs to lunch breaks and convenience stores, to tourists buying drinks from corner shops, to the background noise of a city going about its business. It means nothing until it means everything. Until a man's nervous system begins to fail and a street becomes evidence. In the report, it was an operation planned, authorized, equipped, staffed, deployed. In the body, it was a lifetime divided into before and after. The street keeps making the same sound, traffic, footsteps, fizz long after the people are gone. The last artifact of many operations is not victory, but absence. A chair, a hospital bed, a quiet sound that never means the same thing again.